Hello and welcome to my latest podcast. Today I am going to talk about cabin air quality and the state of standards. The state being the principal backer of standards work and the actual state of standards. So why standards for aircraft? Well, standards are viewed as consensual solutions to the myriad of engineering and technical issues that arise on aircraft. Standards are generally seen as a softer option against hard law in an effort to create a wider compliance and perhaps innovation. They are attractive to legislatures because they potentially take the hard work out of lawmaking. Standards are generally non-binding and have no legislative force, but they are potentially persuasive on compliance where a complaint or problem arises on an aircraft. The argument made by campaigners to join in with standards was this: if we have no immediate opportunity to create hard obligatory law, then we should, as important stakeholders, have a seat at the top table to direct and influence their content. As a result, I found myself working in standards, initially in the United States, along with work in the UK and in Europe. The experience in the United States is interesting. This is because I have recognised the cultural differences that exist between the USA and Europe. This ranges from attitudes towards regulation and deregulation to how businesses are run and how employees of those businesses engage with workplace issues. It has been vital to understand these differences because they help to inform why positions are taken and the potential route to engagement. It has been a mediation masterclass without the formal training. So to give you a few examples of the difficulties, there are times when I've felt that the consumer point of view has been drowned out. But then if you are suggesting the introduction of the precautionary principle into an American standard, you'd better be prepared for the most apoplectic reaction to your proposal. On ground-based thresholds for use in the aircraft environment, there is an abstract debate. For example, it has been suggested that current thresholds do not deliver consideration of the emergency conditions that can arise from a fume event. It has been suggested that they could be increased in line with the US Department of Energy, Health, Safety and Security's Protective Action Criteria, or PAC emergency thresholds. If we follow that logic, for example, the carbon monoxide or CO threshold could increase threefold from the current stated levels. Is this acceptable? I wondered what might be the motivation behind this move. Now, I could be wrong, but the United States may pass or implement a Cabin Air Safety Act. Currently, it's passing through the US Congress. Within the Act, there is a requirement that will require airlines to fit carbon monoxide sensors. I can see the concerns of airlines, worried that CO sensors would deliver repeated warnings which may affect the operation and viability of that aircraft. It therefore raises the point: would the proposed increase in the CO threshold level ensure that the sensor would not be activated so often? Do airlines already know how much CO is present on any given flight? Remember, standards making shifts debate away from any hard law requirements and has delivered a global standards circus where we crisscross time zones to deliver documents that hopefully provide value and fairness for all. In Europe, as campaigners, we challenge the orthodoxy of a published industry standard as not reflecting the reality of flight, nor indeed the participation of a wider stakeholder cohort. That standard was overturned, and new work began in 2015 to create a new European standard. Now, in the beginning it was difficult, with both sides entrenched, but European politics always delivers on engagement and consensus. So in 2020, despite the challenges of COVID and over 1,100 public comments, we produced a draft standard of value. The document delivers a series of mechanisms or hierarchy of controls, all under the watchful umbrella of the precautionary principle. This document does not contain thresholds because that is what all the stakeholders agreed we should do. we went beyond the pass-fail criteria. Our work delivered due care and attention and due diligence, along with consensus from every single sector in this debate. It presents the very best of solutions where formal European regulation has thus far failed. Through this process in 2020, we began to see, however, the emergence of a press narrative that demonstrated that some wished to resile from the previous position of consensus. Equally, during the process of the last 2 years, some external letters were received on cabin air quality. Some of those letters were brought to our attention. Some I have subsequently been made aware of. Now, whilst I could certainly provide extensive commentary on the issues that were raised, I will not do so at this time simply because I wish to respect the fact that they appear to be protected by privacy. But from what I have seen, in my opinion, some contain matters of important public interest warranting at least some form of debate. Currently, this is a matter for others to deal with. There was a clear fear from some, however, that this standard would enter the lexicon of aviation laws. But given that many laws that they refer to as regulations, such as certification specifications or acceptable means of compliances, are in fact voluntary, non-binding standards and have no legislative force, so their fear is somewhat redundant. As COVID entered our lives, some wanted to suspend the work. At the end of 2020, when many expected that the draft standard would go out for a formal vote, potentially leading to publication, we all experienced an interesting commentary and some surprises on the outcome of our expectations. A decision was made for the experts as to what would happen next to the draft standard and its future direction of travel. The arguments I heard to support this action stem from some wanting to give those not in the room the opportunity to submit their own points of view, or a lack of consensus, or a claim of reliance on the so-called Salon case as reasons for not sending the documents out to the member states for a decision. The knot in the argument room simply failed because aviation manufacturers and airlines had been actively engaged in the global standard circus. They would have to be socially isolated not to hear and read of the existence of this European Committee. And in any event, they had representation from the early days on this committee. A lack of consensus also failed because the facts speak for themselves. We had come to trust each other and had defined a clear process that delivered for all the voices through due diligence. The Salon argument demonstrated a misunderstanding of the case, which was a dispute between two technical committees. One committee claimed that the other's published standard should not stand because some of the measures needed to be carried out by qualified people. The important argument, however, challenged that this published standard failed to protect the health and safety of EU citizens. This case simply had no analogy to our present circumstances. So as we all struggled to deal with this new direction of travel, I discovered two important issues. The first related to fuel tank inersing systems, delivering a separation of bleed air gases and compounds, so providing an inert gas for the fuel tanks on aircraft. It caused me to ask, if this separation technology already exists, then why had this not been discussed since 2015? The second relates to a case that came before the European Court of Justice in 2017, which declared that mandated harmonised standards, which are attached to European regulation, should also be considered as law. This decision has already had a profound effect on the standards world, and I suspect some reticence from companies who had been given free rein to define their operations. It got me thinking. The treaties of the European Union provide a division of labour and competency for the benefit of the Union and the single market. One competency is aviation. EASA has been given the competency by the European Union to make regulation. Therefore, the standards attached to that formal regulation, those being the certification specifications, acceptable means of compliance, and so on, must therefore be mandated and harmonised, and should surely now be classed as formal law, with all their apparent imperfections. In my opinion, it presents an opportunity for trade unions across Europe, who should begin the conversation and challenge the status of European aviation standards, utilising the arguments and logic of this case. Would this not create a sense of purpose and legal certainty? What about the benefit to pilots and cabin crew, and ultimately the passengers? So in conclusion, we are now faced with the challenges of recognising the extensive risks that exist in standards making against the risks faced by the occupants of aircraft. In Europe, finding a way to restore consensus, trust, and once again determining ethical intentions. As we subscribe to standards making rules and ethics, how can we ensure that the work guarantees process, enforcement, oversight, courage or stability? Will we once again have to respond to the desire for a performance-based or threshold standard? Should we claim a necessary and properly formed threshold methodology, a clear and open analysis, and a recognition of the wider European Union threshold processes? Will this work lead to arguments without end, when all thought that such arguments had been resolved by consensus? From a personal perspective, if a process produces difficulties that could ultimately deliver detriment to consumers, is it right to continue to legitimise that process? Now, these are difficult questions, but are now accompanied by the need to carry out a continual risk assessment of any standards making process. It is no longer an option not to carry out that risk assessment. So looking forward, I think that there are several immediate challenges ahead for the cabin air quality community. The first is the challenge of the appropriateness of ground-based thresholds against the failure to properly define the uniqueness of the aircraft environment. There needs to be a hierarchy of argument. Secondly, EU aviation law provides a presumption of compliance, which is flawed because it imports the benefit of the doubt argument, resoundingly rejected by the precautionary principle. And finally, we as campaigners have, in my opinion, taken our eyes off the regulatory ball, and I hope others will join me in creating a formal European regulation on cabin air quality. The state of standards are now at a crossroads. What we do next is important for all. Until the next time, take care.